All right, so let's get going. And the business items that I've got down for tonight are to talk briefly about test number 3. Then we'll get into just a repetition of what I've mentioned about test number 4. I want to talk a bit about the Framingham homework assignment. And I mentioned to you about our website is still, I'm going and scrubbing things off of it that don't need to be there. As I told you last week when I was getting ready to take care of some study on the website, you can load things from previous semesters. So that's what I did. And when you do that, it says queued. It's in a queue. Normally that queue takes 2 seconds. Well, last week it sat there, what I was trying to upload was queuing, and literally went for like 10 minutes. So I tried queuing again. That queued for 10 minutes. I had the other thing queuing. And finally I called Canvas. And so it took them probably a half hour to resolve that issue. But in doing so, stuff from previous semesters got copied into our semester. Can't explain to you how that happened, but that was on their back end. So I've got to go through there and slowly but surely scrub out things that don't belong there. Importantly, none of the scores for any of the tests are missing. That was my biggest concern. So I'll continue to clean that up. Test number 3, again, I want to compliment you as a group. You did very well. There are some of you that need to put more time into your studying. So I just encourage you to do that. And what's really fascinating is you'll see students that did not do well in terms of their score on the test, and yet there are questions where they did quite well, individual questions. So to me, that's not a matter of somebody necessarily understanding the material. It's just a matter of preparation. And so if you're one of those individuals, please really focus on this next test, because there's a lot. There'll be even more than what you've seen previously. There's problem solving involving our algorithms, our logic models. You got to know how to be able to play with those. So don't wait till the very end to start studying for this test, because I think that's a guaranteed way to do full on the test. And as I said before, that's going to be on Monday, December 16th. We'll start at 5 p.m. And the reason we're doing that is because for those of you who want to get out a little bit early that night, you'll have the opportunity to do that. And for those of you who cannot show up for whatever reason at 5, no harm, no foul. You'll have plenty of time to finish this. And let's talk about the Framingham assignment. What I did is I was not able on my computers at home to open up that URL that was enclosed in the homework assignment that I had previously. So what I did is I went out and updated it today. Here's a better website to go to. This website is run by the American Heart Association, which, if you're looking for the premier cardiovascular group in the world, that is it. The American Heart Association is, without a doubt, the premier cardiovascular professional society in the world. They crank out phenomenal documents, one of which is on pulmonary embolisms. I think it's like 200, 300 pages long, that one document, in terms of what their recommendations are for things like PEs. Anyways, they've got this risk factor calculator out there, and no matter what risk factor calculator you're using, they're all going to focus on the 3 primary risk factors for the development of heart disease: smoking, hypertension, hypercholesterolemia. And you can mix and match those however you want, but those are the 3 primary risk factors. And if you recall last week, I mentioned to you that there are secondary risk factors. Diabetes is a secondary risk factor. Physical inactivity is a secondary risk factor. And so anyways, in this particular website, and one of one of you from the group came up earlier and told me that they were able to go out. Anybody do the assignment who was out there? Were you able to go out to that website okay?
Yes.
Okay, great, so that's good. So I'm not gonna go through all the descriptions here. What I did do is I included some additional data that I had not included in the previous one. And that's with regards to LDL. So, not gonna test you on this, but it's just good information for you to have. There are different forms of cholesterol. There are good forms and there are bad forms. So the the HDLs, the high density lipoprotein. So lipo, fat, protein. All of you know that fats are nonpolar. They cannot dissolve in water. They cannot be carried in the plasma of the blood. So how do we carry them? And the answer is we stick a protein onto them. That makes it, that complex water, soluble. So when you hear a high density lipoprotein, that's telling you that it's mostly protein and very little cholesterol. That's how you get the high density part. The low density lipoprotein, the LDLs, that's where you got more cholesterol and less protein. And then there's what's called VLDL, very low density lipoproteins. As it turns out, the LDLs play a critical role in the formation of coronary artery disease, where you have this plaque that's formed on the inner walls of the coronary, could be any artery, but we'll say coronary arteries for this purpose. And so the American Heart Association has recommendations about what are high levels of LDLs and what are low levels or acceptable levels. This I do want you to know. The American Heart Association recommends that you have LDL levels below 100 milligrams per deciliter. In this example, so the data I provided here, I'm showing the LDL data of 80 milligrams per deciliter, which is below the American Heart Association's recommendation. I told you I take Lipitor. I believe my last blood results, my LDL levels were 65, which is really nice. So these drugs like Lipitor, the statins and others, are very, very powerful drugs in terms of getting the harmful forms of cholesterol lower. Now, what I did do in this version is just to help make it clearer in terms of this doesn't have to be the only way you present the data, but I believe that this is a good way of presenting the data. So this is at the title, at the title here you can see female risk of developing heart disease. Here's the percent risk of heart disease. And then the different scenarios that you're given up above are shown here. And this particular student used a nice little color code. So you can see that for the normal condition, plotting the change in the risk over the age span going from 40 on up to 79 years of age. You can see that represented here. But you can also see that if we have individuals who have all three of the risk factors, smoking, hypertension, hypercholesterolemia, take a look at the difference here. We're talking about an individual who has none of these risk factors at the age of 79, having about 8-9% risk, versus an individual who has all three, that's climbed up to 42%. That's a huge difference in terms of risk. That doesn't mean that it's going to apply to everybody who happens to have wonderful physiology and has normal blood pressure, normal cholesterolemia, normal levels of blood pressure. It just means that you're going to optimize, minimize your risk. You're optimizing your chances for health. And so, as I said to you last week, very sincerely, if I can meet you guys 50 years down the road when you're my age, and you sat there and said, hey, I remember one thing from your class, and that's the Framingham study, man, my job's done. Because that's good medicine, it's cheap medicine. anyways, I included this. This is all out there in Canvas and in course content. So this will give you an idea in terms of how to present the data. It's not the only way to do it. I'm just telling you this is a reasonable way to do it, and a good way of doing it. All right? Any questions about that? Anybody that did it have questions about the exercise itself? Yeah, anything you found difficult or?
So you want us to do both male and?
Yes, you need to do it for both males and females because, as I said last week, part of the learning lesson here is to understand that when we take a look at men, men die about 7 years younger than women. Why is that? Go take a look at cardiovascular disease and the incidence of cardiovascular disease in men versus women. There's a big difference. Big difference. And that in part explains why men die, on average, probably 5 to 7 years younger than women. And I'm being very sincere about this. I'm coming back from a national meeting, happened to be sitting next to this woman who's a premier epidemiologist, gerontologist, a person who studies aging, and she was sitting there telling me, she goes, 95% of all people over the age of 90 in the United States are women. And you hear a number like that and you're going, that's a mind-blowing number. That's not just a small difference, right? That's a staggering number. And you might sit there and say, who cares? I'm telling you, when you get out there in your 60s, 70s, and 80s, and you've got a significant other in your life, and they pass away, and you're going to be going through a lot of trials and tribulations in terms of your emotions. My father-in-law passed away in 2019, and my mother-in-law now, here she is 5 years, 6 years later, she's still grappling with the emotional toll of losing her life partner. These are life-changing events. So, when you're in relationships like that, you want to make sure that you're all on the same page, trying to enhance or optimize your health. Okay, enough of that. It's hard to think about being my age, but it happens. I remember I had a great zoology teacher, and we were talking to him one night, and he said he was 39 years old. I'm going, gosh darn, he's really old. Okay, well, I assure you, when you get to be 39, you're not going to be sitting there thinking yourself as really old. All right, I think that's it. Any issues we need to address? Other than Elizabeth doesn't want me to ask her any questions, and she said that 5 questions I was going to ask her to ask Eric and Michael to split it evenly. So you said, I heard you said, please don't ask me any questions, ask Michael and Eric. Oh yeah, and you did say Mandy too. Said Mandy. All right, let's see here. All right, so we've talked about this important concept, which is the cardiac cycle. Very simply, we can break the cardiac cycle into 2 phases. There is a work phase, there's a relaxation phase. During the relaxation phase, and again, let me just back up and say, we're left ventricle centric because the left ventricle is responsible for making sure every cell in your body gets adequate amounts of oxygen. The right ventricle does 5 times less work than the left ventricle. And I mentioned this to you before. The left ventricle is doing 5 times as much work. It has an oxygen demand that's 5 times greater. And that's why most heart attacks occur on the left side of the ventricle. So when you got coronary arteries that are blocked, that has tremendous ramifications for the left ventricle and heart attacks. All right, so you learned that the stroke volume, which is the volume of blood pumped out during each beat, different way of saying it, the volume of blood pumped out during each cardiac cycle is known as the stroke volume. And because EDV and ESV are the determinants of stroke volume, we're taking a closer look at the various factors that determine each of those. So under end diastolic volume, you've learned that the three primary determinants of end diastolic volume are filling time, the wall stiffness or the wall compliance of the left ventricle, and filling pressure. And under filling pressure, we've got things like blood volume, venous tone, the effect of gravity, muscle activity. Those are the factors that determine filling pressure, and we went over that last week. So tonight we're going to focus on end systolic volume, and the factors that determine that are so-called afterload. I want all you to write this in your notes right now. Afterload goes by another name, and that other name is diastolic blood pressure. So as you will learn, the diastolic blood pressure determines the end systolic volume. There's what's known as the Frank-Starling mechanism. Write this down. The Frank-Starling mechanism goes by some other names, one of which is the law of the heart. So the Frank-Starling mechanism is very commonly referred to as the law of the heart. There's another name we could give it, the length-tension relationship. Some of you did not know the length-tension relationship in test number 3. As I explained during class, that is one of two primary factors, the skeletal muscle, that determines its performance, the other being the force-velocity relationship. And then, you can see in the outline here, I've got the regulation of calcium. And there, make sure you understand this is the regulation of intracellular calcium concentrations. Mr. Bennett, on the last test you were asked to describe some factors that are different between skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle. How about with respect to the sarcoplasmic reticulum? Does that fall into that list? And I forget. Can you tell me if there was a difference between the sarcoplasmic reticulum and the skeletal muscle? Cardiac
Yes,
muscle.
skeletal muscle will have the highest, I guess, development or the highest amount. Cardiac is going to have a little bit less, I guess, moderate.
So the word I gave you was moderate, right? So as it turns out, in the heart, the calcium that's released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum can only activate about 50 to 75% of the contractile apparatus. And what that means is that other sources of calcium can play a critical role. And you've learned about calcium channel blockers, right? Maybe we could use calcium channel blockers to treat the heart.
What was the percentage that you said?
About 50 to 75%. Anyways, we're going to talk about end systolic volume. Once I'm done with that, we'll talk about ejection fraction. And then from there, we're going to talk about pressure volume diagrams. And I mentioned this before, and I'm going to say it again to you. Pressure times changes in volume is work. This is a very important conceptual diagram. The pressure volume diagrams are very, very important conceptually. And there are 4 phases. There's what's known as phase 1, or the ventricular filling phase. There's phase 2, which is known as the isovolumetric phase of systole. There's phase 3, which is the ejection phase of systole. And there's phase 4, which is known as the isovolumetric phase of diastole. And these are all very important conceptual things to learn about the heart. Okay, so we certainly aren't going to get past that tonight. there's a lot to do with end-systolic volume. Here's afterload. Well, you might sit there and say, gosh, if there's an afterload, is there a preload? And there is. And it turns out that the end diastolic volume is the preload. Do you need to know this diagram for test number 4? Absolutely. Do you need to be able to do problem solving with this diagram? Absolutely, with double exclamation marks after it. This is your algorithm. For those of you going off into PA school, nursing school, nurse practitioner school, this is essential to know. All right, so let's talk about afterload. Afterload has another name, as I already mentioned just a moment ago. This is our diastolic blood pressure. Smells good. So this is this diagram that I put up before, especially related to talking about the effect of gravity. Now we're going to use it to illustrate another aspect of our story. Let me just show this piston-like structure here. The piston-like structure is just simply meant to represent the pumping action of the left ventricle. This chamber, if everybody just look up here, this chamber is meant to represent the left ventricle. And this piston that moves up is simply meant to represent the contractile properties of the left ventricle itself. We've got our aorta, and there's a valve that regulates the flow of blood from the left ventricle out into the aorta, into the arterial tree. And all of you anatomy students from last semester, Mr. Cow, would tell me that the name of this valve that regulates the flow of blood from the left ventricle into the aorta is known as the, thank goodness these anatomists made it easy on us, right? Keep it simple. So we have the aortic valve. Please understand that the direction of the leaflets is very important. You can sit there and say, oh, I'm going to show the leaflets going downward. But that's not the appropriate anatomical orientation of it. So the heart contracts, the left ventricle contracts. It pushes blood out into the aorta, then out into the arterial tree, and then it relaxes. And when the left ventricle relaxes, the pressure in the aorta and the arterial tree starts to go down. And we'll say that it goes to a value of 80 millimeters of mercury. And we're going to label this as our diastolic blood pressure. And so what you need to appreciate is that we have a force. This pressure is acting in that direction. It's acting in this direction. It's acting in this direction. And it's also acting in this direction, pushing down on the leaflets of the aortic valve. Well, the left ventricle begins to contract. And as it does that, the pressure within the left ventricle starts to go up. But if the pressure is 40 millimeters of mercury inside the left ventricle, Mr. Cow, you're going to tell us the position of that aortic valve is what, open or closed?
It is closed.
Mandy, if the pressure inside that chamber is 70 millimeters of mercury, what's the position of the aortic valve? Open or closed? She told me to ask you about that. See? Open, right? So the question is, if the pressure inside the left ventricle, 70 millimeters of mercury, is the aortic valve open or closed? And the right answer is it's open. No? It's closed. How about if it was 72 millimeters of mercury? How about if it was 79 millimeters of mercury? How about if it was 81 millimeters of mercury? That's exactly right. Very good. So, in order to get the aortic valve to open up, we have to generate a pressure here that exceeds the diastolic blood pressure. What do you think? Anybody in here, can anybody in here come up and draw the force velocity? Oh, I thought you were here.
Bad timing, I wanted to go to the bathroom.
Ms. Jocelyn, could you come up to the board and draw a force velocity relationship for us? No? Anybody in here remember the force velocity relationship? One of the two most important mechanical properties of skeletal muscle. And, come to find out, cardiac muscle too. Mr. Bennett, are you volunteering?
If I get it wrong, is it the end of the world?
You're gonna give it a shot, right?
Sure.
Sure, why not? Here you go. Okay, all right. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
What do you guys think? That looks good to me. Doesn't look good to you?
I don't. Along with thinks that the axis should be switched.
Okay, so he says the axis should be reversed, right?
Yes.
Did I do a good job?
No, I
No.
don't do a good job.
Not like-
You told me to reverse the axis. I did exactly what you said.
No, that's fine. Never mind.
Yes, sir.
I think it's like an inverse relationship.
It's an inverse relationship, that's right. Isn't it? Yeah, inverse relationship. For the individuals who are mathematically adept, this actually would be referred to as a hyperbolic rectangle. So let's just say that that's our force velocity relationship. Mr. Bennett, what determines the shortening velocity according to that curve right there?
The type of,
The curve, look at that curve up there. What determines shortening velocity based upon that curve?
I was gonna say the type isoform, but I don't
No.
know if that's right.
All I want you to do is look at that curve up there.
What determines the force velocity of that curve?
Mr. Wen, what would you say?
Force.
What determines the shortening velocity?
Force factor.
Force production. That's exactly right. The force, the load that the muscle is working against determines the shortening velocity, right? If the muscle has to work against a very heavy object, it's producing a lot of force, but by definition, the shortening velocity will be slow. On the other hand, if the muscle is working against an afterload, that's low, according to that diagram there, the shortening velocity is going to be high. So here's an afterload. According to this curve here, I'm going to come along and I'm just going to say that at that point right there, this is just purely conceptual, represents an afterload of 80 millimeters of mercury that the heart, the left ventricle, has to work against. And knowing the force velocity relationship, you'd sit there and say that at this afterload, this is the shortening velocity at which the muscle will work. What do you think? So now we're going to fast forward time. And we're going to talk about Mrs. Jones. Mrs. Jones now, she's your age, but we're fast forwarding her life by 50 years. Now she's 70 years old, and she's going to see her doctor, and her diastolic blood pressure has snuck up. It's no longer 80 millimeters of mercury, but it's 95 millimeters of mercury. That's the afterload. That's the load that the heart is having to work against. So here's my question to all of you, is that for Mrs. Jones, what will the shortening velocity be with the afterload being higher? Is it going to be the same? Will it be slower or will it be faster? The shortening velocity.
Slow.
What do you say?
Slow.
You said slower. Maria, what would you say?
Well, if the force production is higher,
If the heart's working against a greater load, then according to that relationship up there, its shortening velocity will be
lower.
It will be slower, that's exactly right. So let's put that data up here. We're kind of exaggerating things to kind of emphasize the point, but we'll sit there and say that Mrs. Jones' diastolic blood pressure is now 95 millimeters of mercury, and the shortening velocity is going to be slower. What do you think, Mr. Lemming? Does that sound good?
So, yes. Yes.
I heard you, yes, I heard it. Now we're going to come over here, right there, because that's where we're at. So if the shortening velocity is slower, what's going to happen to the volume of blood that the left ventricle pumps out? Is it going to pump out the same amount of blood? Will it pump out more blood, or will it pump out less blood? What do you think, Mr. Lemming?
Less blood will be pumped out.
Why do you say that?
Well, because unlike when it was 80 milligrams of mercury, the pressure of the blood in the left ventricle will only be at 95 when the valve closes, so less blood will be coming out.
Less blood will be coming out because of what?
Because there's more pressure pushing into the ventricle.
Okay, there's more pressure pushing in the ventricle. Remember, the pressure is not coming into here. This is the pressure the heart has to work against to get that valve to open up. Okay? Anybody else? Miss Jocelyn, what would you say? Is the heart going to pump out the same amount of blood, more blood, or less blood per cardiac cycle?
If the afterload is 95,
Yeah. What would you say?
the afterload is 95, so the left ventricle is working against the higher load.
Load.
Meaning that it should pump out less.
Why?
That's a great question.
It's all Logic 101. That's the cool thing about this, it's Logic 101. Here's our heart. We'll just show the right, the left ventricles. I'm going to represent a sarcomere, because the sarcomeres are the contractile units. By the way, sarcomeres are not muscle cells, as some people told me on this last test. The sarcomere is just a tiny little piece of a muscle fiber. Here's a sarcomere. Tyler, that sarcomere, the shortening velocity is going to be what? It's going to be normal.
It'll be less
It'll be less. It's going to be slower, right?
slower.
And so if it's going to be slower, then the walls of the ventricle are going to shorten at a,
Slower rate.
and if they're shortening at a slower rate, then the flow of blood out of the left ventricle is going to flow out at a
Slower rate.
slower rate. That's exactly right. Do you guys get that logic? Is that if the heart is working against a greater load, remember, there are two primary determinants of the mechanical ability of muscle, cardiac muscle: the length tension relationship and the force velocity relationship. And if the heart is having to work against a greater load, according to the force velocity relationship, its shortening velocity is going to be less. That means it's pushing blood out at a slower rate. Now, done with you. What's going to happen to end systolic volume? Because our stroke volume, which is a very important determinant of cardiac output, which is a very important determinant of oxygen delivery to the cells of the body, that's why we're concerned about all of this. What's going to happen to our end systolic volume?
should go up.
It should go up, which means that stroke volume is gonna go up, right?
No, it should go down.
Oh, very good, very good. You didn't want me to walk you into that. So many students sit there and go, oh yeah, something's going up, cardiac output's going up. No, you did that exactly right. Is that our stroke volume, oops, what happened to me over here? Jeez, shame on me. Ooch, 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 ooch. A stroke volume is simply the difference between EDV and ESV. And if ESV goes up, by definition, that difference gets smaller, right? That means stroke volume gets smaller. Thumbs up, good job. So under afterload, you're going to put force, velocity, relationship. Okay, now earlier, so we're done with afterload unless there's any questions about that. But afterload is the load that a muscle, could be skeletal muscle, could be cardiac muscle, the load that the muscle is overcoming. Any questions, confusion? Please don't be bashful. I'd rather have you ask questions here than get questions wrong on the test. Okay, we'll move on to Frank-Starling mechanism. Earlier, talking about the Frank-Starling mechanism, I told you that there's a different term that can be used instead of the Frank-Starling mechanism, and that's the law of the heart. But I also told you that there's another thing that you could use to describe that. And what was that?
The length tension relationship.
2 thumbs up. That's exactly right. The length tension relationship. So remember, the length tension relationship is simply describing the relationship between the length of the sarcomere and the maximal force it can produce. And you learned that there are 3 different regions of the length tension relationship. There's a so-called ascending limb of the length tension relationship. And in this limb, as we go from short sarcomere lengths to progressively longer sarcomere lengths, we can see that force increases as there's more and more overlap between the thick and the thin filaments. There then is a plateau. And there's a third region called the descending limb. And here, that's a nice term because it tells us that as sarcomere length increases, the ability of the sarcomere to produce force decreases. So let's just talk about the descending limb, and we're going to come along and we're going to say, hypothetically, I'm just going to use green to tell this story. Here's the sarcomere length that corresponds to our end systolic volume. Let me say that again. This sarcomere length correlates with the end systolic volume. Sit there and think about the logic. We're in systole, the left ventricle is contracting, and the sarcomere length is getting progressively less. And so at the end of systole, we're at the shortest length of our sarcomere. Here, I'm just going to come along and I'm going to put end systolic volume. Now, we're in our cardiac cycle and we go into diastole. Now the ventricle fills up with blood. And as the ventricle fills up with blood, that lengthens the sarcomere. So this will be equivalent to the end diastolic volume. There's a problem here. Andrew, what's the problem? What's going to happen to the contractile efficiency of the heart when it enters into diastole and it fills up with blood? It will decrease. And so if it's filling up with blood and we're stretching out the sarcomere so long that their ability to produce force goes down, are we going to be able to get rid of all that blood that filled up the ventricle? Sit there and think about this. As the ventricle fills up with blood, you don't want its ability to produce force to go down. You want its ability to produce force to go up. Right? We want to get rid of that blood. Because when we're out over here, during each succeeding cardiac cycle, if we can't get rid of all the blood that filled up the ventricle, guess what? The ventricle just keeps dilating and dilating and dilating, and pretty soon you end up out over here somewhere. What's going to happen? You're going to be dead. You're going to die. None of you ever are going to operate on the descending limb. Ever. Well, let's imagine that the heart works on the plateau. So here we are. Here's our end, here's the sarcomere length that corresponds to our end systolic volume. Now we go into systole, we fill up the ventricle with more blood. That stretches out our sarcomeres, and this is our new EDV. Well, if we're operating there, and then I do this, I go home, and I lay down. No harm, no foul, right? Miss Kaylee? Miss Maria. There I am, standing up, going back and forth. Back and forth there. Now I go home and I lie down. Where are we at in that diagram? You see all the answers are in that diagram right there. You just need to know where to look. You need to know the logic. What do you think?
Well,
I lie down.
yes.
Come a second.
Feeling pressure. So as you lay down, the effect of gravity lowers,
Fantastic. Keep going.
and so the filling pressure goes up, which means that your preload will go up as well, which is your EDV.
Okay, so fantastic. So I want to hear filling pressure goes up, and then you're going to say EDV is going to go up. You said preload's going to go up, so good.
EDV.
Good on you. Very good. So EDV goes up. Here I am, standing up, oscillating back and forth here. Now you just told me when I lie down, I'm going to have an increased EDV, which means what's going to happen to where I'm operating here. If I increase EDV, I'm stretching the sarcomeres out
Down.
more, right? I'm
Yeah.
stretching the sarcomeres out even more. I'm going to put EDV prime. What do you think? Does that look good? Because as soon as I go out over there, what's happening to my ability to pump blood out of the heart?
It's gonna lower.
It's going to go down, right?
Less force
And now I'm in this bad situation where I'm not getting rid of this extra volume of blood on the first cardiac cycle. On the second cardiac cycle, it's even worse because I'm walking this direction here. I'm walking out onto the descending limb. No bueno. None of you are going to operate on the plateau region. So there's only one other place for us to work. We don't operate in the plateau. We don't operate in the descending limb. Instead, we operate in the ascending limb. So here's our end. Here's the sarcomere length that corresponds to our end systolic volume. And we'll say that here's the sarcomere length that corresponds to our end diastolic volume. Now, Maria, I go home and I'm operating as I'm staying here talking to you. I'm operating back and forth here through each cardiac cycle. And now I go home and I lie down, and you're going to tell me that effective gravity goes down, filling pressure goes up, EDV goes up, and that's going to stretch sarcomere length out more, right? So the heart's filling up with more blood. How do I get rid of this extra amount of blood that came back to the heart? And the answer is through the Frank-Starling mechanism, or the law of the heart, or the length-tension relationship. Because now my new EDV is out here, but the beautiful thing about all of this is that the force that my ventricle is going to produce is going to go up. And I'm going to pump out that extra volume of blood that came back to the heart on that cardiac cycle. What do you think? That sounds pretty cool to me. And so, in your heart, in your sarcomeres, and within each sarcomere, we've got this length-tension relationship that provides basically a sensor for each cardiac cycle. And when we fill up the heart with more blood, we lengthen the sarcomere, we move further up the ascending limb, we can contract with more force and pump more blood out. That's pretty cool, isn't it? That's built in to the sarcomere. How the heck did that come to be? That's pretty amazing. So, very important thing to now appreciate is that EDV determines ESV via the Frank-Starling mechanism. So I'm going to draw a dashed line from EDV, and beneath this dashed line we're going to put the word preload. That's pretty cool physiology right there. The preload is the stretch on the sarcomeres, which determines where we're at in the ascending limb of the length tension relationship. Okay, time out. Questions, confusion, don't be bashful. Please.
Can you repeat that one more time?
Yeah, which part?
The last, how the preload determines the.
Yes, this, it's really quite simple, actually. I know when you're first learning this, it's not simple. So I'm not trying to trivialize that. But the way I think about it is here's our sarcomere. And let's say that we're now in diastole, and so the ventricle fills up with more blood. What's going to happen to the length of that sarcomere? It's going to get longer, right? So all we're doing is we're all operating out here, and where we're at within the ascending limb depends upon what our end diastolic volume is. That's the preload. That's the stretch of the sarcomere. That determines where we're at here in the ascending limb and determines the amount of force that the ventricle will be able to produce.
Thank you.
Yeah, go for it.
Are there any heart complications that would push someone to a different part of the?
You can have various overload scenarios that might push you in that direction. But as I said, none of us in here are going to have those problems under normal conditions. You'd have to have very abnormal physiology to do that. Very, very abnormal. Force-velocity relationship determines our end systolic volume by determining where we're at within the force-velocity relationship. The Frank-Starling mechanism, the law of the heart, is our length tension relationship. Where we're at on the ascending limb determines our ESV. The higher up we are on the ascending limb, what? The higher up we operate on the ESV, what's going to happen to end systolic volume? The higher up I am here, the more force the ventricles can produce, right? And if the heart produces more force, it's going to eject more blood, which means that your end systolic volume is going to go down. This happens to all of us. We go out, we run around this building. Your muscles have this increased demand for oxygen, which means they have an increased demand for blood flow, which means there's an increased demand for cardiac output, which means there's a demand for an increase in stroke volume. How do we produce that increase in stroke volume? We increase EDV, we decrease ESV. That's how we get our stroke volume up, our cardiac output up. All right, so let's talk about that third one over there, the regulation of intracellular calcium. And over here, we've got voltage-gated calcium ion channels. activation of beta 1 adrenergic receptors. And number 3, the sodium calcium ATPase pump. Ooh, some interesting stuff right there. And I see a lot of drugs coming. Here's a simple diagram of a cardiac myocyte. We've got the sarcolemma, we've got T-tubules, and more sarcolemma. We've got our sarcoplasmic reticulum. You know that there are 2 functional regions of the sarcoplasmic reticulum. There's the terminal cisternae, which is right here. The terminal cisternae is the region of the SR that butts up right against the T-tubule. And it's easy for students to sit there and go, oh, there's really a large space between the membrane of the T-tubule and the membrane of the terminal cisternae. It's really easy to come away with that impression because I'm drawing it that way. But in reality, that distance is incredibly small, incredibly short. It's something like on the order of 5 nanometers. And this has made it hard because it's such a small gap between these 2 membrane structures. It's made it hard to actually understand the biology that exists between these 2 different parts. But coming back, all of you know that within the membrane of the terminal cisternae, there are these calcium release channels. And their job is to allow calcium to flow out of the sarcoplasmic reticulum with the calcium binding to troponin C. I'm not going to describe the rest of it, but all of you will understand the excitation, contraction, coupling mechanism. Something that all of you should go back and just refresh your memory on in preparation for test number 4. And within the lateral borders of the SR, we've got these calcium ATPase pumps, which play a very important role in the relaxation of both skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle. But for our purposes, there's these voltage-gated calcium ion channels within the membrane of the T-tubule. Eric, I haven't asked you a question tonight yet, have I? Not really. In skeletal muscle, how do we get those calcium release channels of the SR to open up?
So, the propagation, the action potential.
Okay.
Um,
Question I'm asking is, how do we get those calcium release channels to open up?
oh, the calcium release channel, with the linker protein.
That's right, very good. As it turns out, in cardiac muscle, there are no linker proteins. It's actually the influx of calcium through these voltage-gated calcium ion channels that then causes the calcium release channels to open up and release calcium from the SR. So here what I'm going to do is I'm just taking this arrow with calcium and I'm just going to put up here, I'm going to put CICR. This is our transduction mechanism, CICR. What does that stand for? CICR. That stands for calcium induced calcium release. Circuit. So one of the things that's different about skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle with regards to this transduction mechanism of excitation, contraction, coupling is the mechanical connection between the voltage-gated calcium ion channel and the calcium release channels in skeletal muscle, whereas in cardiac muscle, it's actually the influx of calcium through this voltage-gated calcium ion channel that causes our calcium release channels of the SR to open up. Hence the term calcium-induced calcium release. Good term, I think. It's very descriptive. Just give me 1 second. Okay. These guys go by another name. What is that? Here.
The hydroperides.
Fantastic. Very good. DHPRs. So we got Mrs. Jones. You guys remember Mrs. Jones? She's our 70-year-old who's now hypertensive. I told you earlier that her diastolic blood pressure is 95 millimeters of mercury, but more importantly, her systolic blood pressure is running 190 millimeters of mercury. Remember, I mentioned this last week, for the women in her, your average systolic blood pressure is going to be somewhere in the 110s-ish range. For the guys, it's going to be 120-ish range. So we're expecting, if there were any one of you in here, that you would be 120-ish or less. But we got Mrs. Jones, she's at 190 millimeters of mercury. And what's the clinical horizon of hypertension? This is another thing. Again, if I can meet all of you 50 years from now, you sit there and say, one of the most important things I learned about was the importance of blood pressure in my health. And you taught us that there was this clinical horizon of hypertension. Ms. Camilla, what would you say? 140 over 90. There's no doubt. We bring her back multiple times and her blood pressure is really elevated. And you as being good healthcare providers are going to jump all over this. And you're going to sit there and more likely say, you know what, we're going to have to be a little bit more aggressive here. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to prescribe for you a so-called calcium channel blocker. So, Mr. Bennett, you prescribed this calcium channel blocker for Mrs. Jones. Tell us what's going to happen. By the way, the answer to my question is over here. In that problem-solving model. Beep.
We're gonna be
Beep.
increasing
Beep.
our
Beep, beep, beep.
ESV.
Don't let her EKG. So you're doing what?
By regulating the calcium, we're increasing ESV.
So we give her a calcium channel blocker, and being the excellent healthcare provider that you are you going to give her a calcium channel blocker that's going to block all those calcium ion channels, those voltage gain calcium ion channels?
Not all.
Why not?
Flatline.
Flat line, ah. Yeah, if we blocked all of those, how much calcium would be released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum? Your answer is?
0.
0. Okay, so now that we got that out of the way, so where are we in our model over there? Are you under EDV or ESV?
ESV.
Fantastic. And for ESV, where are you at? The answer is obvious. Are you under afterload? Are you under the Frank-Starling mechanism?
Regulation of calcium.
Regulation of calcium. So are we going to be releasing more calcium that can bind to troponin C or less calcium?
Less calcium.
Less calcium. And so you said that the end systolic volume will go down, right? Because the heart's going to produce less force, which means that the end systolic volume is going to go down.
No.
No?
No. I want to say no because I know that by increasing ESV, we would be lowering the stroke volume and lowering blood pressure.
Huh.
I hope I said that right.
What do you think, Mandy? Do you agree with him? Huh? What do you say? What? He is right. Yes? No? Maybe so? We're going to cause end systolic volume to go up. Right? That's what you said. And you also said that if this goes up, and we leave this the same, then the difference between the two means that our stroke volume will go down. And so you're saying that pressure will go down as a result, right? Is there a mathematical relationship you could use to help me figure out that? Because I'm not sure about that part.
I'm sure there is, but
I'm sure there is too.
nothing comes to mind for me.
Mr. Looming, what mathematical equation, what physical principle would you apply to better understand how a decrease in stroke volume would cause pressure to go down? Starts with a O and ends with a M. Go for it. Ohm's law. Ohm's law tells us that flow rate is equal to delta P divided by R. Well, we're not interested in flow rate right now, right? We're interested in blood pressure. So we're going to rewrite this equation. We're going to sit there and say that pressure is equal to the flow rate times resistance. Mr. Bennett, in that simple equation, where is cardiac output?
Pressure, P.
No, cardiac output is not pressure.
Wait, cardiac output.
Yep.
Force. Force times resistance.
No, there's no force there.
Wait, what is
This
it?
is Ohm's law.
Flow.
Flow rate, flow rate,
Flow.
there it is right there,
Okay.
equals delta P divided by R. We rewrite that equation, solve for pressure. And so you told us cardiac output's going to go down by definition. And you also told us properly that pressure would go down, which is exactly right. But I challenge you to come up with a mathematical relationship to prove that point. And there it is right there in the form of Ohm's law, right? If flow rate goes down, sit there and think about this. What's creating the pressure in the first place? The pumping action of the heart. Let's use the most extreme example. The heart stops. What happens to blood pressure? We solved the problem. Mrs. Jones doesn't have to worry about hypertension anymore. Oh, wait a minute. Mrs. Jones' daughter has a lawyer called Larry H. Parker. You guys are too young to know about Larry H. Parker. But there was a very famous commercial that used to be on TV all over the place. Hi, my name is Larry H. Parker, and I'm here representing Mrs. Jones. And we're suing you and your hospital for $500 million. And he must have won a lot because he sure as heck had a lot of commercials on TV. All right, so we're going to use calcium channel blockers to try to treat Mrs. Jones. Well, what are some calcium channel blockers? One, very commonly used or prescribed is verapamil. Another one, nimodipine. Nimodipine, verapamil, nifedipine. Is that right? Just make sure. Yeah, nifedipine. There we go. Okay, now one of the things I've encouraged all of you to do is have a separate piece of paper that has a quote-unquote drug list on it. On that piece of paper, you should have things like albuterol, doxazosin, what other types of drugs have I told you about? Botox? You got Botox on your list? Okay, all right. Anybody else? Now you got 3 more. You got verapamil, nimodipine, nifedipine. And this is where we're gonna end tonight, but, yes?
Is amlodipine one of them as well?
Amlodipine is a very commonly used calcium channel blocker. My wife happens to be on it. She's at 5 milligrams a day.
What about losartan? What's that?
Losartan, I wanna say, don't quote me on this, I'm gonna have to look it up. Losartan, I think is a calcium channel blocker. If not, it's a ACE inhibitor. I'll have to look that up. Yeah,
What about HCT, hydrochlorothiazide?
hydrochlorothiazide,
Yeah.
really powerful drug, a really nice drug. One of the top 100 drugs according to the World Health Organization. And you're gonna learn about that, except that works on the kidney. So. Good drug. Hydrochlorothiazide, right? That's what you're talking about, HCT. Good drug. Very effective. Very effective. When we come back on Wednesday, we pick up the story. And we're gonna come along and we're gonna talk about how the involvement of the